Thanks, everyone, for joining us, the Project Censored Radio Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your co-host, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad right now to be joined by MiDian Shofner, who's the CEO of the Epitome of Black Excellence and Partnership and the owner-founder of 8pm Consulting for Humanity. MiDian's work is founded upon three core pillars designed to catalyze learning, reflection, growth, and societal transformation aimed at educating and empowering individuals to confront and dismantle the insidious forces of racism and injustice that plague our society. MiDian, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Of course, Eleanor, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you on. And actually, so listeners know, I was recently on an Abolition panel with MiDian and invited her to come on this show because I so appreciated what she shared there. And I kind of wanted to actually pick up a little bit where we left off there. And the first thing that I wanted to bring up is something that I see a lot out there in the world with regards to the escalation of ICE violence, the murder of people in the streets in broad daylight and such. And, you know, I see signs that people carry, or I hear people say like, oh, this isn't who we are. And I'm like, maybe not as human beings, but as people in the US and as the US experiment, absolutely, this is who we are. And I was wondering, starting off here, could you talk a little bit about understanding this chain of custody that takes us from slave patrols to the police, that recognizes things like the scalp bounties in today's maneuvering of CBP and ICE, and how that requires us to look at our national history in order to understand where we are and also how we get out of this place in time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you're spot on when you talk about, you can't divorce what's happening today from historically what has been very prevalent, particularly in our country as it pertains to policing. Policing was established, it was never established under the form or the thought of care. It was always about control. It was protection of property. It was never about the protection of people. So when you think about what we're seeing in times today, you can layer that over what we've seen in times of past, where it is a matter of who is deemed worthy, who is deemed worthless, and the badge that these things are being done under is deputization to essentially affirm our society's notion of who is worthy of protection and who isn't. So, when people say, hey, this isn't who we are, like you said, it might not be who you are when you are in your moments alone, but as a collective, that's what these systems have been designed to do, is remove us from humanity and attempt to dehumanize us from seeing each other as person to person, and then more so leaning into ideological type of things that do divide us. So the systems are very lubricated in that manner. And I think it also is a challenge for all of us to understand that when these things are happening and we are grappling with what we are seeing, we have to understand that is the punishment of being a bystander. You have to engage, you have to push back, and you have to do that for the sense and the sake of your own humanity. If you're not pushing back and you're not truly an anti-racist or an anti, person that is pushing out these pains, you are essentially just the foundation of what it sits on. If you aren't taking an active role in the pain, but you're not taking an active role in the atonement, then you are a part of the problem, right? And so when we talk about what does it mean to get out of this, we have to take the time to linger in the reality of what has happened over the course of time in this country. And that is what, at some point, some generation hopefully will be able to say, let's linger in the pain so we can actually talk about who are the experts in the pains of these stories. Because those that have come with what they call solutions typically are not the ones that are the experts in the pain. So we just get different iterations of solutions that are not informed by the reality of what is happening. So if we want to get out of this, if we truly want to get out of this, Eleanor, you and I might not see this in our lifetime, but if we truly do believe in something different, then we have to lay that foundation. We have to be the start of that. We have to be the catalytic person or generation that starts an atonement process. And that is simply started at just admitting that these are wrongs, these are sins of our country, and we have to be ready to admit that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that one of the things that you do is is very much steeped in political education and understanding, contextualizing our time. And one of the things that I found interesting was there was a recently an article that was talking about how, especially, and I can speak to this, growing up as a white kid in the South, we didn't really hear about John Brown. We certainly didn't hear about white folks who organized in the civil rights communities and organized for desegregation and things like that. And I think that also helps to contextualize what we saw happen with folks like Renee Good and Alex Preddy, because people were saying, oh well, this is a new frontier, and it's like, well, it's not. White folks who go against the state have also been in the crosshairs historically. It's just that we're not taught about that, and that whiteness does not always equal immunity. It depends on how that whiteness is used. And I think that speaks to what you were just saying about, like, we have to be a catalyst, we have to engage in this way. And I'm also curious, in terms of political education, how do you feel that this then shows up in the ways that communities should talk about the issues, as you point out in your bio, the forces of racism and injustice that plague our society? How can we better show up? How can we be those catalysts by understanding what has come before and how we can engage today, not necessarily just as white folks, but understanding how racism shows up today?
Yeah, I think that the first thing that I typically encourage um, communities to do is, first and most importantly, especially for the white community, say out loud to yourself that stepping in and being a part of the change is not revolutionary. It's not revolutionary. You literally are simply not accepting the fact that there are people that are being harmed and being treated in a way that is not something that any of us should embrace. So, one of the exercises that I do is I'll tell people to close their eyes and to imagine the words in big block letters. Imagine the word anti-rapist and start asking yourself a series of questions. If you are witnessing somebody being raped, ask yourself, are you going to actually do something? Are you going to try to intervene? Are you going to scream out, shout out, say something, and engage because you see it happening? And then ask yourself another question. If you overhear someone talking about planning to rape someone or conspiring to execute that and to live that out, are you going to interject yourself and try to say something that is going to deter that person from doing that? And then the other question that you'll want to ask yourself is, if you hear someone telling their story about being raped, are you going to retell that story? Are you going to be the person that says, well, maybe you shouldn't have worn that. Maybe you shouldn't have drank so much. And decide who you are in that narrative. And if you can say that you would in fact intervene if someone's being raped, you would in fact speak up if someone is planning it, and you would in fact actually listen to someone that is telling their story, then you can count yourself as an anti-rapist. So when we talk about racism, closing your eyes again, just simply imagine that word and replace the P with a C. And start asking yourself, if you see someone that is experiencing racism, are you going to interject yourself? If you hear about someone planning to conspire racism, are you speaking up? And if someone is telling you that they're experiencing racism, are you going to retell that story? Because if you can't answer the same way as an anti-rapist as you can an anti-racist, then you really need to ask yourself, what position are you in when it comes to this conversation of racism? It's not revolutionary. It is simply not accepting what it is that is happening, and it is taking your resources, your skill sets, your network, and your love, and simply interjecting yourself to see a different outcome. So when we do this collectively, we don't have to wait for someone else to tell us how to show up. You have it in you. It's inside of you. It's just a matter of making sure that when you show up, you don't speak over, but you speak with.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And it reminds me of a friend and mentor of mine, Kilo Nyasha, who said that, you can never get to the point where you're just like 100% anti-racist. It's like you were raised in this, you were the fish figuring out that the water is there. And oh my God, what do I do? Like, what do I do with this information? We're constantly learning and understanding that community also includes tripping up, but it also means continuing to do the work. And that it's more about moving in an anti-racist way as opposed to just being like, I'm fully, I'm a qualified anti-racist now and I've
Correct.
done the thing.
Because it's an action word, right? It's an action word, and it's you have to stay activated, you have to stay engaged, and again, it's something that we have to push back every day, because every day that we wake up, every day that we engage in our society, we absolutely pull and ascribe to white misanthropy. We pull that lever because we live in that society. And oftentimes people say white supremacy, I say white misanthropy, but that's what I'm saying. We're pulling that lever every day because we are engaging in this system, right? We're pulling the lever of capitalism because that's the system that we live in. And so you have to make a very intentional series of choices of what is it going to take in my space and in my contribution to community to push back and to be that voice that very well could inspire what happens next. And hopefully we are inspiring the change that all of us need to see, because if not, we're just going to be passing a baton down to our next generation that has to endure this in a way that will be perpetuated by our own people.
Yeah. And I wanted to kind of zoom out a little bit here, because I know that you're in Denver, and I was recently speaking to 3 Southern journalists on the show who have spoken and written about how the South is really a mirror that's turned to the U.S. that the U.S. does not like to look at. And we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois' quote, "As the South goes, so goes the nation." And of course, part of this is to understand how the South bleeds and has bled into all the corners of the nation. The idea that the problems of the South are just somehow geographically specific, that's a fallacy. And yet there's still this feeling like, I remember when Elijah McClain was murdered by cops in Aurora, there were folks saying like, oh, wow, in Colorado, that's weird. And it's like, well, it's only weird if you think that that sort of thing only happens in the South, or that it's localized in these areas. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the danger of framing systemic and federal racism as a regional problem rather than a national one.
Absolutely, and I think it's a simple it's a simple discovery that when the Great Migration happened, right, and there were a lot of people in the Black community in particular that were evading the South because of the Jim Crow laws and all of the things that were happening. Black people weren't the only ones that were leaving. That migration was happening across the country. We definitely romanticize it because of the Great Migration for Black people, but they weren't the only ones migrating. And so the traditions and the things that were happening across in the South were happening across the country. When we talk about Colorado in particular, so I'm 4th generation Colorado. My children are 5th and my grandchildren are 6th. So we have been here for a very long time. And my family, it probably comes as no surprise, they were a huge part of curating the Black experience, from the celebrations that we had, from the fights that we had to pursue. So with that, I have a lot of knowledge of the history of Colorado, and absolutely it was happening here. We might be West, but Colorado was one of the furthest West states that required federal intervention for school desegregation. Our bus depot in Denver, the city of Denver, the capital of Colorado, our bus depot was bombed just back in the 60s because of desegregation. So you can look up the Keys case. It was a federal case that required that desegregation take shape. And so that was happening in the schools. That was what hit the headlines, but that was also happening right on the blocks that you would walk, right? So people might think that Colorado is also progressive, and I push back. Colorado is not a progressive state. We absolutely had sundown towns. We have a Klan registry that you can look at that is appalling. And we are still seeing the outcomes for our young Black community, particularly Black men, that are being killed and slaughtered by the police. We're actually right now in the midst of a crisis of injustice. You know, Elijah McClain was one that took a global movement, but I'll tell you what, when Elijah McClain was first murdered by the police and the fire department in 2019, after they did that investigation internally, they said there was nothing to see. It took a global movement for something to happen in the Elijah McClain murder. So the governor had to assign the attorney general as a special prosecutor, but the governor did that in response to the rise of the people. So these things are happening right here in our state as well. And if we try to isolate it to the South or to other parts of the country, we are turning a blind eye to the pain and the agony that our community is experiencing. And that also leaves the stories that are happening in isolation. And the biggest benefit of stories in isolation is the system. So if these stories are isolated to just the South and we're never thinking about what's happening in other spaces, that's what the system needs in order to continue to thrive. And it's an entry point of the oppression Olympics, right? Like you see what is happening. What happens one place is happening somewhere else. And that's just the reality of it, because it's a systemic issue. It is not isolated. It is not happening in a vacuum. It is systemic.
And it's also, speaking of systemic issues, I mean, all of these things are, of course, connected with, militarized policing and the murder of Black folks by police, but organized abandonment, the purposeful siphoning of resources and indeed just life force from these Black communities. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how that is basically creates this, prison pipeline through this organized abandonment in these communities.
Absolutely. The divestment is a part of the algorithm, right? You divest in a community, and that makes the community something that becomes aesthetically not something that people are excited about. And then all of a sudden, you start to associate the people with being the problem, or the people that live in those communities, that are confined to those communities, as somehow, some way being a menace to the way that we are supposed to be living in this proper way, right? So it's not about, when we talk about branding the people, that's a big part of the problem. We have to brand the system, right? So when you have a community that has been divested in, or there hasn't been any type of supports or things that are going into that space, and then you layer that on top of, well, since they're so aesthetically unattractive, or there's so much that we're, just kind of snuffing our noses to, then it justifies almost that you over police, right? Because who cares about that community? And we start to label the people instead of branding the system that is causing these problems. So, and we also have to understand and acknowledge that these systems are an issue, and there are people that are actually holding up the system. So the system needs the people to push the buttons and to make sure that the gadgets and the widgets are coming out and producing the way they should. But if we start talking about this from a lane of, this is an issue that is systemic, you start to remove the need to dehumanize those who are experiencing the system. So that is definitely an algorithm, and it's a tactic of the way that our structures exist. You show that divestment, and there starts to become this overwhelming component of rationalization across the communities that don't experience that, and they rationalize their way into why that community deserves the harms and the patterns that they're experiencing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think something that's important as you noted, I mean, there are people holding up the system, and there are those of us who don't recognize that we are also on this spectrum of disposability, right? We might just be further towards this side of it. But I think once you recognize that we all, I mean, except for, the Elon Musks or whatever, exist on this spectrum of disposability, we see that abolition is it's not like this far-flung idea. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about abolition as not just this kind of whimsical idea, but as a tactic and as an action that is not so much destructive as it is constructive.
Absolutely. So I think the term abolition, right, is that fear mongering because people seemingly think that abolition means that you burn it down to a crisp and then all of us are now just living in this, this demise of that's not what abolition is. Abolition is it's tiered, right? The first thing it is acknowledgement and recognition that we have a problem. The second piece is not accepting the outcomes that that problem is producing. The third piece is organizing around what the problem actually is causing and the lived experiences of those who are in the midst of the core of the pain. And then that fourth layer is now coming together as a collective to say that we need to shift this in its entirety. That means that we do, in fact, dismantle what exists and then rebuild what we need in order to get different outcomes. So when you hear the term abolition or abolitionist, and you're not able to see through to the rebuild and the reconstruct and the rise of what happens as a collective, then you are not reading enough. You simply are not reading enough. Go pick up a book. Go do something to ensure that your brain activity starts to flow a little bit better because abolition actually means coming together. It is a collective design for all of us to ensure that we are going to dismantle this and stick around to rebuild. Now, I will say that there are people that I have seen speak in terms of abolishing something. And I have seen that they will come in to strip something down and they are not looking to stick around to build it up. That is not an abolitionist. That is someone that is destructive, period. And that's it. And so for those who are in fact out there that are just looking to tear down and you're never thinking about the solution, again, I would encourage you to read more because you really do need to ensure that if you are coming into a space to create something different, you have to be willing, ready, and equipped to rebuild it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important part. And I wanted to dig into that a little bit more because I think so often people, it's a lot easier to point out what's wrong. Like once you start reading, you're like, wow, this whole system is racist, capitalist, it's misogynist, it's toxically patriarchal and things like that. It's easy to kind of say, oh, these are the problems, but the building is so much more difficult also because it requires that community building that is something, again, like the US is predicated on this kind of individualist breakdown of community. We're not supposed to come together with each other. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, in terms of the build, like, how do you feel that looks, particularly when the lived experiences, though there are through lines, the community building that takes place in New Orleans is not going to look like the community building that takes place in Denver and all across this remarkably large nation state. So I wanted to get your thoughts, like, how do we approach this building, understanding all of these contradictions and these barriers?
Absolutely. And that is, that's the part that is not cookie cutter. Well, none of it is, but that's definitely the core of making sure that you're not doing this through a lens of everybody gets the same, right? So when you talk about rebuilding, I think the first thing we have to do is we have to ask ourselves, who are we dubbing as the experts in the room? Far too often, there is someone that has multiple acronyms behind their name or multiple statuses that they've held in the midst of their career. And I'm not knocking anyone's work. Go get your degrees, go get your work, do your thing if that is your calling. When we talk about community and when we talk about rebuilding something that we have never experienced before, your PhD is not going to get us there, because your PhD is possible because it's in a book, right? You can study it, you can take a test, you can write a dissertation, and you're going through a process that is possible. When you talk about rebuilding, we need impossible leadership. We need the ones that say, I actually am committed and convicted to the impossible, something that does not exist. And so we have to start asking ourselves, who is the expert in the room? Because there are families that my organization walks alongside. They are experts in a story that I don't want. And Eleanor, you wouldn't want, right? I don't want to be an expert in what it means to bury my child because they were shot 7 times in the back with an AR-15 by a police officer. That's the story of Veronica Sebron, because her son, Jalen Sebron, was killed by Douglas County sheriffs, again, in quote unquote progressive Colorado, right? But she has an expertise that I never want. But when we talk about changing the law, and we talk about what does it mean to actually figure out how do we ensure that this doesn't happen to someone else, I'm looking for Veronica to give me an expertise about what exactly do we need to start seeing and thinking about and realizing. And we talk about how we think of anything from mental health to maternal health, all of the things that we need to start touching to create something different. We first need to make sure that those who have lived experiences are informing the work. And then those who have the PhDs and the resources to make it happen, you're not the expert. You're the one that has the responsibility to ensure that the resources start to exist. And we have to be comfortable with that. We have to be comfortable with making sure that those who are experiencing this pain and living it out loud the loudest are the ones informing what do we do next.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also speaks, there's sometimes in spaces, there's a distrust or a mistrust of those who are quote unquote experts. And like you said, I think it's just a reframing of what an expert is. It doesn't mean that somebody wrote a book on it. It means that somebody has that lived experience that sheds light on the deep, deep chasms of abandonment and oppression. And they're the ones that should be talking about how to structure it so those things don't continue to happen.
Absolutely. And it becomes holistic, right? Because now you're talking about not just what happened, but what was the entirety, the totality of what took place, right? How did it impact family? What type of mental health supports were necessary? What type of things can we be thinking about that we probably have not thought about that we need to bring into this space to be thinking about it holistically?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, when you were talking, I was also thinking about the San Francisco Teachers Union, who recently won a really groundbreaking contract. And in their contract, they speak to so many issues that, aren't technically in the purview of education, right? They're talking about sanctuary for migrants. They're talking about good, like healthy food. And it's like, well, of course, of all of these things are interconnected. And how can you really talk about taking care of kids if they don't have access to good food and healthy water and healthy air? How can you talk about taking care of kids if they can be kidnapped at gunpoint by ICE? So, like, of course, all of these things are interconnected, and you only get to that if you actually talk to people who are the most impacted and are at the most risk in the crosshairs of the system, for sure.
Yeah, and I think that scares a lot of people because we've never measured competency, right, on understanding the relationship that people have to what it is that we are trying to resolve. We measure competency on how many hours did you read the book, how many, what was the grade on the paper. And again, I'm not saying we should not be studied. What I'm saying is that is not enough. That is not even scratching the surface of the realities of what we need to be thinking about. Because if you've never experienced a hungry child, having to go to school and what it feels like to know you're sending your child into school hungry because you have never had to have that internal conversation with yourself. You've never had to figure out what does that mean? How does that translate to any of the things that your child is going to experience, right? And so if you've never experienced it, there are going to be parts of it that you never had to think about. And it's okay to admit that, right? It is not something that has to be taboo, or, but again, if it's about status, and if it's about title, and if it's about all of the acronyms that come after your name that give you some type of access to this divine wisdom, that's what we need to start pushing away from. And we have to stop looking for ways for our name to be on the book and start looking to acknowledge that you actually don't want to be the author of that book. Again, I don't want to be an expert in what it means to bury my son. I can't write that book, and I am ecstatic to say that. But I do know that there are women that can write that book. And if they're going to selflessly live their pain out loud and choose to say, I'm not going to accept what happened to my child, I'm going to push back, I'm going to fight back, that's where we need to say, this person is selflessly telling us what we need to be thinking about. Because they don't have to, right? They don't have to grieve out loud, but they're choosing to do that so that this world can see something different, so that I don't become that expert, and you don't, Eleanor, and anyone listening doesn't become that expert in that story. And that goes across all systems of oppression. People will live it out loud and scream and shout because they don't want this for themselves or anyone else. That's selfless.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that this also speaks to the kind of performative activism, if you will, that social media has really promoted, that like everyone should have a hot take on things and everyone should be able to speak on things. And perhaps the best hot take is just to not. And also in these days, like the actively listening, not just like just shutting up, but actually listening is not something that's uplifted. It's not something that we're really taught beyond, sitting in school and listening to them, completely twist history. But the actually just saying like, actually, I don't know how to speak to this, so maybe I will just listen and learn something. That's just not promoted.
Agreed. Agreed. And and I think that that's also something that we have to think about from a societal lens, right? I mean, likes and shares and all of that. Like when people love the sound of their own name, and I mean that's also very honest, right? Like all of us are living our lives, and we're the main character in the story, right? We're the superhero in the story of the life that we live, and so we love to hear our name, and that's something that we have to remember, that the names that we actually should be calling and lifting are the ones that are hurting the most, that didn't sign up for that type of storyline. They didn't sign up for that. They could choose. They would probably say, I would rather live a quiet life. I just want to raise my family, experience happiness, and be able to, love my neighbor as well, right? But these oppressive systems thrust people into a storyline that they didn't choose. And then we'll see people speak over them. We won't remember their name. And again, it becomes a tagline as far as, who said it the best or who's most profound. That's not what we should be seeking. We have a lot to grapple with.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I mean, there's so many threads to pull on here, but just thinking about this, the aspect of journalism here too, and how these become extractive practices. Like, oh, I'm gonna, a journalist saying, I'm gonna go talk to the mother of this boy who was murdered, and I'm just gonna get the story, and then I'll leave, and then it's over. It doesn't matter. And it's like, well, but it does matter. And you can't just extract that pain, use it for a byline, and then say bye. Like that's horrific. And it really reinforces, because the media is how we view the world, it reinforces this idea that, oh, well, that's a bummer that her son died, but let's move on. And it makes it into a passing headline as opposed to a point of entry into really addressing and changing the systemic ills that, again, that we all exist on on a spectrum.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the momentary pieces of it are probably what is, again, that role of a bystander is painful. We really have to understand that as we participate in these spaces as a bystander, we are not, even if you take a moment to even say, like, man, that's really hard and I wish that didn't happen, if you're not living purposefully to figure out, like, what is my entry point? Because we're all guilty of the bystander role. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not, right? But what I will say is that when you start to live purposefully and you start to understand that I actually do have a role to play, you're going to find your entry point. And I can assure you, it is going to be powerful and meaningful and impactful. But if you make a choice to shrug or to stay silent or to never take the time to leverage what you have access to push back against this, history's not kind to the bystander either. Because think about it, right? Think about the stories that we've heard in history. And sadly enough, oftentimes when we hear history, our minds are trying to tell us that it's hypothetical. It's not hypothetical. We actually are living out a lot of the things that make us cringe. We are living it out right now in real time. But somehow, some way, we are not inserting ourselves into what do I do to play a role in something different. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting how we can think, we can read history, we can be privy to history, but not even recognizing that we are living out right now probably answers to history questions in like 30 or 60 years.
Yeah. And the question, what would you do? That's happening right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
MiDian, I feel like I could sit and talk to you for hours, but alas,
I love this, Eleanor.
it's always incredibly wonderful to speak to you, and just the thoughts and the ideas that you throw out there are so generative, and I know that listeners will feel the same. Folks, do check out MiDian Shofner's work. Again, she's the CEO of the Epitome of Black Excellence and Partnership and the owner-founder of 8PM Consulting for Humanity. MiDian, thanks again so much for the work that you do and for coming on the show to talk with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.